What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments. The last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There is a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist U.S. society. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story collection of alternate history, What If Natives Won? Or Killing Columbus. I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. Much of the racism in American history and the weakness and instability in Mexico and the rest of Latin America can be traced to the invasion and taking of half of Mexico and 1/10 of its people. The U.S.-Mexico War crippled Mexico and made the U.S. far more powerful, as well as guaranteeing a faster American Civil War. California became the wealthiest part of the U.S., with Hollywood, Silicon Valley, gold, oil, produce, and many other products, and most of its Pacific coast. The U.S. would be far less of a world power without the Southwest, and far less racist, especially toward Latinos. And the U.S. would never have seized the Southwest or gone to war at all without first a group of pro-slavery Americans taking over Texas. They wanted Texas to be a U.S. slave state, asking to join only 2 days after going to war. The U.S. president turned them down. They'd have to wait 9 more years for a pro-slavery U.S. president who wanted more slave states. Texas, as a so-called independent nation in a so-called republic, was incredibly lucky. Mexico's elites were divided and fighting among themselves. There were over a dozen presidencies, many of them the same men repeatedly, overthrowing each other. Spain also kept reinvading, and the British and French also sent troops or ships to attack Mexico. There were other separatist revolts at the same time. Mexico was broke and with a poor economy and an army of untrained draftees with outdated weapons. Because Texas was a sad excuse for a nation and government. It had 9 capitals in 9 years, often in buildings that were small, run down, and not much more than cabins. These towns with as few as a few hundred people often physically fought each other and stole government records. It had 2 of the men running for president killing themselves. Their navy was a joke. Its ships kept sinking not from war, but from their own captains' incompetence. Its armies kept getting defeated, captured, or deserting. Texas, the nation, and government were incredibly incompetent, but also incredibly brutal. The Texas government ordered ethnic cleansing of natives and Mexicans. President Mirabeau Lamar declared, quote, "The proper policy to be pursued toward the barbarian race is absolute expulsion from the country. The white man and the red man cannot dwell in harmony together. Nature forbids it. He also called for, quote, an exterminating war. No compromise and no termination except in their total extinction. Lamar drove out 13 tribes, plus Mexicans in 6 towns. His ethnic cleansing was only stopped because Texas went bankrupt. The good news is there is not just one way to defeat the Texas would-be republic. There are many. I discussed several before in the What If Native Series 1. And Comanches could ally with Germans. Mexico could bring in the 5 tribes as a buffer against the U.S. instead of Anglo-American colonists. Karl Marx could even have led an uprising, since he originally planned to move to Texas. But let's focus instead on 2 other ways the would-be Texas insurgents could have lost. The first way is by slave revolt. Mexico had made slavery illegal. The biggest reason American colonists revolted was to hold on to their slaves and make Texas a U.S. slave state. Among the first laws the would-be republic passed was making slavery not only legal, but ordering free blacks out of Texas. Texas also made it illegal for slave owners to free even their own slaves. And the Texas Congress was banned from limiting slavery in any way. From the start of the revolt, slave owners and other white racists feared slave revolts. Some slaves fled to or joined the Mexican army. American insurgents executed some slaves. In 1835, in the Brazos area in Texas, over 100 slaves revolted. So slave owners and the militias rounded up slaves in advance of the Mexican army. Almost 100 of the slaves were whipped, and an unknown number murdered. If this slave revolt had spread further, American insurgents would be too busy fighting it to defeat the Mexico army. The would-be slave state is crushed. The second way to defeat Texas's uprising to be a slave state, and much easier, is to defeat the Texas militia at San Jacinto. Contrary to myth, Santa Anna was a fairly capable general. He defeated most of his enemies. He defeated Spain's invasions. He defeated rivals and separatists a dozen times. This included defeating the insurgents at the Alamo, where that Texas uprising made a series of foolish mistakes and got themselves wiped out. At San Jacinto, Santa Anna made 2 mistakes: not posting sentries and not having an avenue of escape. Remove even one of these mistakes and the insurgents lose. The American pro-slavery uprising is mostly killed or captured. 5,000 colonists and illegal immigrants to Mexico, 1 out of 6 of every colonist in Texas, were already fleeing and will return to the U.S. Others likely will join them. They would be replaced by colonists from the rest of Mexico, and natives and runaway black slaves from the U.S. With no new slave state, the first free state in the U.S. causes a crisis, an early U.S. Civil War in the 1840s. There is no U.S.-Mexico War, no loss of half of Mexico. Prosperous California added its wealth to Mexico. Mexico and the U.S. are equally powerful, and a less powerful U.S. is less of a danger and less of an exploiter of Latin America. This is the end of the 12th video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if the U.S. war with Mexico is avoided.